Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. Hi little doodles, it's Amanda. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. Today I'm sitting on the floor talking to you guys. I'm trying to make the videos more chill and casual and easier for me to film, and I guess my way of doing that is to sit on the floor. I don't know, it just feels more like I'm chatting with a friend or something, so that's the vibes that we're going for today, I guess. Anyway, of course, today we're going to be planning together. I'm doing my May 2021 bullet journal setup. It's springtime. We need a fresh new bullet journal setup for the month. The warm weather is here, so I'm ready to go. Recently, I've been like journaling and drawing with my window and balcony patio door open, and it's just been so nice with the breeze coming in, so I am loving it. I also just wanted to say thank you guys so much for your amazing response on my video from last month, the April Plan With Me. It was definitely a different format and a different topic than what I normally do in my Plan With Me's, but I saw a lot of comments of people supporting and sharing their own stories, and that really meant a lot to me, especially because that video was so hard for me to make and to put out there. I was scared before uploading it, but definitely made it all worth it in the end. But because of that video, I really want to do more of that style of voiceover with like a podcast style, maybe talking about something. So if there's anything in particular that you guys want me to talk about, maybe there's something you're curious about in my life that I can talk about during these voiceovers, just to make things a bit more interesting, spice up the voiceover, maybe share some stories and make it more personal and fun like that, then let me know in the comments like some topic ideas and stuff, and I can definitely incorporate that into future Plan With Me's. With that being said, you guys know what time it is. Grab your pencils and pens and notebooks and tea. But tea is not really like springy. What's like a spring equivalent of tea? Like a smoothie? I don't know, a juice? Grab your juice and a snack and let's start planning. So when I asked you guys on my YouTube community tab page as well as my Instagram what theme you wanted to see me do for this month, some of the most popular responses that I got were a cottage core theme, a fairy theme. I got a lot about gardens and frogs, and I decided to merge that all into one big theme. And that theme is this very enchanted forest garden fairy tale-esque theme. You'll see that I drew a lot of mushrooms and toadstools with a frog, as well as actual fairies and bees and insects, and I used a lot of the like fairy tale lettering that you would see in storybooks to create this setup. I know cottagecore and fairycore has been really popular lately, so I'm definitely not the creator of this aesthetic or this idea. Actually, on TikTok, I feel like everyone's kind of obsessed with frogs right now, so that also kind of inspired this theme. Now, the reason why I'm telling you all of this beforehand is because I thought that it might be fun to change things up for this voiceover. You guys seem to really enjoy my last Plan With Me video where I talked over the video but didn't necessarily narrate exactly what I was doing in the bullet journal, just kind of talking about my experiences, almost like a podcast that you can listen to while watching. So since this video and this bullet journal theme is a fairy tale theme, I thought it kind of would be nice to read you guys some old fairy tales that I found kind of interesting. And I thought it would go along with this theme, and maybe you can just listen to it, maybe you find it relaxing. Sometimes people say my voice is relaxing, but also sometimes people say that I sound like I'm crying, so you know, either way. Before I read you guys a couple of fairy tales, I thought it would be nice to start off with the history of fairy tales. So fairy tales are a form of short stories that often include mythical entities such as dwarves, dragons, elves, fairies, mermaids, talking animals, unicorns, and usually a lot of magic. Most of the fairy tales that are repeated and passed down today date back to the 17th centuries, and they were passed on from one century to the next, and a lot of them have actually been altered as they've been passed down to remove some of the more scary parts of the story, because if you read some vintage old fairy tales, they're actually quite dark and disturbing, and it's kind of interesting that we associate it with like children's stories nowadays. As I mentioned, a lot of these older fairy tales were passed down verbally, but the first attempt to preserve them in a written collection form were actually by two brothers from Germany, and they were called the Brothers Grimm, and they're responsible for a lot of the fairy tales that you guys know today, such as Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, Rapunzel, Little Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, the list goes on. There's literally so many. It's kind of crazy how much these have been passed on to the point where pretty much everyone universally knows these stories today. Anyway, on to our story time today. I'm going to be reading you guys a fairy tale about fairies. Not all fairy tales do include fairies, but this one does happen to. And fairies are the tiny mythical being or creature or spirit that are often used in older European cultures like Celtic, Slavic, German, French folklore, and they often have a very supernatural or protective magic and charm to them. Of course, the whole folklore of fairies is very broad. There's probably so many different types amongst history, but a lot of times in fairy tales, I've noticed that they tend to be very playful and almost a little vengeful. And that's what this fairy tale is about. This is called The Fairies of Merlin's Crag, and I'm going to be reading a readapted version, but the original is actually from Scotland and it dates back to 1889. Anyway, get yourself tucked in, get a cup of tea, and let's begin. There are certain places where the very earth itself is charged with that fiery, unpredictable energy known as magic. One of those centers of enchantment is in Lanarkshire, Scotland. You have to tramp for miles and miles across a bleak, soggy moorland to reach it, but eventually you'll see a mound of jagged rocks rising out from the peat bog, and that will be Merlin's Crag. The folk who live thereabouts say that over 1,000 years ago, the famous wizard Merlin lived and practiced his magic amongst those rocks. No doubt he made use of his spells of the black peat that was all around him. You see, peat is like no other earth, for it burns and gives warmth and life to the people who seek out a living on the moorlands. A few hundred years ago, a poor but honest man worked on a farm near Merlin's Crag. And one day, his master sent him to the crag to dig up slabs of peat and fetch them back for fuel. The man did as he was told, and he'd just begun to slice the ground with his shovel and lift up the peat, when all at once, the smallest wee woman that he had ever seen in his life appeared before him. She was certainly a dainty little creature, perhaps no more than 2 feet high. She was clad in a green gown and red stockings, and her long yellow hair tumbled down to her waist. The man was dumbfounded. He stuck his spade into the ground and gaped at her. She wagged her finger at him and said angrily, "What do you mortals think you're doing when you dig up our roof? How would you like it if I came along with a giant spade and took the lid off your house?" She stamped her wee foot and demanded, "You put that turf back at once, or you will rue the day that you ever lifted it." Now the poor man's teeth began to chatter with fright, for he had heard stories of how, when a mortal offends the fairy folks, the fairies wreak a terrible revenge. He swiftly shoveled the peat back into his place, patted it down nicely, and returned to his master to tell him what had happened. The master only jeered at him. "A fairy, you say? Taking the roof off of her house, were you? Drinking whiskey, more like it. Now go back at once and fetch me some more peat, or there will be no wages for you this very week." The poor man had little choice but to do as he was told, for he had to feed his wife and his 2 wee children. So he spent the next few days working hard, digging peat and fetching it back to the farm. During this time, no fairies appeared to him, not a single one. A year went by, and the man still had not caught sight of another fairy, and he began to think that his master might have been right. Perhaps he had only seen the fairy in a dream. Autumn went by, and then winter and spring, until once again it was summer. It was the very same day that he had lifted the peat the year before. The man had been working hard on the farm, and his master was pleased with him, and gave him a present of some milk to take home to his family. He set off on his journey home with a spring in his step and was humming a happy tune. As it was such a nice evening, he went home the long way, over the moor, by a path that led past Merlin's crag. When he reached the crag, his legs felt strangely tired, and he sat down on the ground and soon fell into a deep sleep. It was near midnight when he was awoken by some strange but lively music. He rubbed his eyes, and what a shock he had when he saw that a band of fairies were dancing around him, glowering at him and pointing their wee fists in his face. He got up and tried to start on his way, but wherever he went, the fairies danced in a ring around him. Then out of the ring stepped a lady, and the other fairies laughed and called out, "Dance, man, dance." When the lady reached up, she took him by the hands. Although he had never been much of a dancer in his youth, he found himself waltzing and reeling as if he had been a dancer all his life. His head felt happy and light, and he forgot all about his home, his wife, and his children. The whole night long they danced on until at last they heard the shrill sound of the farmyard rooster greeting the morning with his loudest crowing. All at once the merriment ceased. The fairies stampeded headlong towards the crag, and they dragged the man along with him. A door opened up in the rocks, and in they all clattered. The door closed behind them, and they led the man down below the ground into a dimly lit hall. Here the fairies busied themselves with tasks. Some dipped quill pens in magic ink and copied out spells and fairy laws onto scrolls of parchment. Others were making fairy honey out of flowers, and still others were distilling fairy whiskey. The man could do nothing but sit and watch and be amazed. Towards evening time, the wee woman in red stockings, whom he had first seen a year ago, came before him and led him back up to the door by which they had entered. She said, "The turf which you took from the roof of our house has reformed, and there's grass growing over it once again. Now you may go home, but you must swear never to tell any mortal of our secrets." The man swore never to tell the fairy secrets to a living soul, for he had seen some things which I have not been able to tell you about. And the door opened, and he went back out to the moor. When he reached home, his wife stared at him in amazement. She seemed somehow to have aged. Then his children came down into the hall of the house, but they were no longer wee infants, and they did not know him. "Where have you been for all these long years?" demanded his wife. "How could you do such a thing as to run off and leave your wife and children to fend for themselves?" The man did not know what to say to this, but he soon learned that the one day he had spent underground had lasted 7 years, while the turf grew back over the fairy's roof. From that day on, he never again dug peat from that part of the moor, or even dared to venture near Merlin's crag. The end. Yay! I hope you guys enjoyed listening to that story. That was, again, The Fairies of Merlin's Crag. I'll link the story that I used, or the rendition that I used, down below in case you want to actually read it. Again, it's a really old Scottish tale, so it might not be true to the original, but I hope you enjoyed listening to my narration of it. I actually really enjoyed reading the story out loud. I have done picture book reading streams on Twitch before, so I guess this is kind of similar. Anyway, there's still some time left in this video, so I thought I would take up this time by actually talking about some of these spreads that I made. So as you guys saw, I created this kind of enchanted woodland forest scene on the cover page. I added a lot of toadstools, different plants, and frog, of course, as well as fairies floating around. And since this is a very drawing heavy theme, I know that that cover illustration was more complicated than I normally do for my bullet journal setups. I really wanted to use some of the motifs throughout that were a bit more simple so that it would make it easier for me to set up my bullet journal spreads. So what you'll see in all of these spreads and the tracker spread that I'm creating now is I used the ornate lettering, you know, in the storybooks, the fairy tales, where they have the first letter of the sentence, like once upon a time, and the O is just a very ornate ornate and detailed and has all these curlicues and fancy letters in a box. That's what I used. I thought it looked pretty good and I loved the look of it. And I also used the toadstools and the mushrooms because those were pretty easy to doodle, as well as these fancy borders in the corner, because a lot of times in vintage fairy tale books, I feel like you'll see all of these detailed doodles as a border in the illustrations. So I used that in my spreads, and I just had a lot of fun with it. I really love the way this turned out. In terms of the trackers, I have my individual habit trackers as well as my mood tracker, in which I'll just be drawing a line depending on my mood. And you guys know already, for the individual habit trackers, I just label which habit I want to track above those small calendars. Initially I was gonna read 2 fairy tales in this voiceover, but there's not that much time left in this video, so let me know if you guys liked this format of voiceovers, if you want me to keep including things like this while I narrate my plan with me. I think they're kind of fun, but also maybe you guys thought it was kind of weird. I don't know. Midway through creating this setup, I actually remembered that I had this parallel pen, and it's just this calligraphy pen that has this very straight, blunt edge, and you can use it a lot to create those gothic letters, which are seen a lot in those old fairy tale storybooks. So I wanted to attempt to use it for the title of one of my spreads, so I used it when I was creating this dashboard spread. It didn't really turn out that well. I might have to practice using this pen quite a lot more because it's a bit difficult. But for this dashboard spread, I just have a section for my shop stuff, which I have a lot of brainstorming to do because there's a lot of things that I need to work on this month with shop. I have my package tracker, which I've shown before, and as well as a list of my favorite songs. I didn't make a full-on playlist spread this time, but as usual, I will be linking my Spotify playlist down below in case you're curious on whatever my current jams are for the month. And I finished it off by adding those fancy borders, the lettering detailing around the first letter, as well as some mushroom doodles in the bottom corner of the shop spread. Also, while I'm filling time in this voiceover, I did just want to say, keep your eyes peeled for something coming from shop this month. I'm not going to tell you when, I'm not going to tell you what, but something's happening. Now moving on to the final spread, which is my first weekly spread of May. For this one, I decided to do a vertical layout to give myself some more planning space, so I split it up into 6 columns. I can't remember the dot spacing, but I think it's like 8 grid spaces with 1 space in between. Don't hold me to that. The weekend will be split up into 2 in the corner, just to make things easier in terms of divisions. And for this, I really loved the little curlicue details that I was using throughout, so I used those on the tops and bottoms of the daily columns, which I think turned out really well. It looked very royal and enchanted almost. And then for the headers, I just did a simple green highlight. I put the numbers of the days in those detailed ornate decoration boxes, and I thought that this made it stand out really nicely and looked like the cover of a book for each day almost. These are actually a lot simpler than you would think to doodle. I honestly just drew a rectangle and then drew a lot of curlicues inside. I used a very thin fine liner for this. I think I mostly switched between the 02 Saccharopigma as well as the 01, but since it's so small and the details are so fine, there's no pattern that I was using. I was just kind of doodling curlicues, and it just turns out well when you look at it from afar anyway. And then all along the bottom where there's some empty space, I doodled a couple toadstools and mushrooms, as well as different grass and plants. And I also drew some fairies floating around with the bees, and I thought it turned out pretty cute. Of course, you gotta add all those sparkly bits to make it look more enchanted. And if it was not very clear already, I just really had a blast filming this video and drawing this setup and coming up with ideas. It was so fun. So 10 out of 10, recommend creating a fantasy fairy tale in your bullet journal. Before I show you guys the full flip through of my May bullet journal setup, I wanted to talk a little bit about today's lovely sponsor, Squarespace. You guys know I love Squarespace. I use it for my own personal website, amandarachely.com. If you've been meaning to make your own website, whether it be an online store or a portfolio to showcase your work, Squarespace is the perfect all-in-one platform to help you do so. I know how overwhelming it can be to build websites, especially if you don't have that much experience in web design, but Squarespace makes it super easy. Trust me, you just drag and drop everything and there are a ton of beautiful designer templates for you to use and to make them your own. Besides all the marketing tools and analytics and that sort of stuff, they have a lot of features that are great for artistic, creative people like you guys, the little doodles. I know you, I see you. One of my personal favorite features is the automatic image scaling and the photo galleries. It makes it really easy for you to upload and import photos from your social media platforms, and they just automatically rescale it so that you don't need to worry about everything looking off on your website. And then also for any of you guys who are running your own business or maybe starting your own side hustle, Squarespace's commerce platform is really great. And they even have something called Squarespace member areas, which allows you to connect with your audience even more and create extra revenue through gated members only content. And you can manage all your members and email communications straight on the platform. So if any of you guys have been meaning to create your own website or maybe upgrade a current one, I definitely recommend Squarespace. You can head to squarespace.com/amandarachely for a free trial and for 10% off your first purchase of a domain or a website. Thank you again to Squarespace. They're a huge friend to the channel, so clicking that link definitely helps us all out, and it's a win-win situation. All right, back to the flip through. Here's the final flip through of my fairy core slash cottage core slash fairy tale enchanted garden theme May 2021 bullet journal setup. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to the fairy tale that I read you, as well as watching me set up my bullet journal for this month. Okay friends, so that is all I have for you today. Thank you for stopping by again. As usual, I'm going to showcase some of Lil Doodle's awesome recreations from April over here. Just look at them. I always love scrolling through my Instagram and seeing how you guys get inspiration from my theme and also make things your own. So if you recreate this month's setup or any of my previous month's setups, then be sure to tag me on Instagram. You can tag me in the photo and then also use our hashtag #LilDoodles. And of course, if you're curious to see what other spreads I create during this month's setup, then I definitely recommend you come hang out on Twitch. I do my weekly spreads every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern time live. It's a really fun time on the streams, very chill vibes, and it's just great. I love the Twitch streams. The Lil Doodle fam there is also awesome to chat with, so you can come hang out there to see live stream weekly spreads. Well, I hope you have a great day or night, whatever time it is when you're watching this. Keep doodling, and I will talk to you in the next one. Bye guys, love you.